Thanks again for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about vaccine misinformation narratives and data deficits. So, we're going to cover three things today. First of all, common vaccine narratives that we've seen online, on social media, in particular from the research that we put out last November. Second of all, we are going to talk about data deficits on topics related to vaccines where there is not enough credible information. Then thirdly, we are going to talk about oversupply where we have too much information. So just to introduce myself, my name is Esther Chan. I'm First Draft's APAC Bureau Editor and I'm based in Sydney. Last November, we published a report titled Under the Surface, COVID-19 Vaccine Narratives, Misinformation, and Data Deficits on Social Media. So for that report, we analyzed 1,200 vaccine-related posts across social media, and we identified the dominant narratives in an attempt to understand how the vaccine discourse on social media was being framed. And these are the 6 dominant narratives that we found. In the first session of this presentation, we're going to go through each of them along with some examples. And as we dive into these narratives, I would like you to think about 3 questions. The first one is, how does this help me understand the concerns people have about vaccines? Or does it help me at all in understanding their concerns? So if you joined our last session, we talked a little bit about the language differences between vaccine narratives. So one of the examples we provided is that the liberty and freedom narrative was big in English-speaking discourse, but not so much in Spanish-speaking discourse. So some of these may not apply to your language or your country. And the next question I want you to think about is what kind of information would help address these concerns? So here we're thinking about solutions. How does understanding any of these concerns help determine the kind of information that I want to put out to address it? And the last question, what are some keywords that I could use to research this topic further? So here we're really paying attention to language. So the choice of words, the hidden meaning, etc. And if you were in our last session, you know that there were 2 main narratives that were particularly dominant across our research into different languages, which covered English, Spanish, and French. And the first one was political and economic motives. So a couple of examples of narratives that fall into this category. The first one is that concentrated financial interests drive vaccine development and undermine its safety. That leaders are promoting vaccines for political gains, that corrupt governments and media outlets serve as mouthpieces for big pharma. The thing that ties us together here is the mistrust of politicians and the mistrust of the influence of money, essentially. The second major narrative that we saw across all 3 languages was safety, efficacy, and necessity. So some examples of narratives that fall into this category. Number 1, the COVID-19 vaccine is the ticket back to normality. So in our research, we didn't focus only on negative narratives, but also the positive ones, basically any predominant narratives that we saw across social posts. And this is saying the vaccine is going to cure everything, that it's a silver bullet. So a silver bullet is essentially like a magical thing that solves all the problems. And even though the silver bullet narrative is promoting trust in vaccines, it's actually setting up unrealistic expectations. So when the vaccine turns out not to be the magical solution we assumed it would be, then that can be easily spun into disinformation. Another narrative that we saw is that a healthy immune system is more powerful than a vaccine, which means vaccines are not necessary. If you take care of your body, then you'll be fine. There's also been a lot of misinformation coming out from the alternative therapy wellness world. So sometimes these narratives can also be linked to skepticism about pharmaceutical companies as well. Another narrative is that mRNA vaccines and GMOs are not safe. So concern about the mRNA technology, concern about the ingredients of vaccines, as well as their safety. Another one that we came across often while we were conducting the research is that since you poison your body with drugs and alcohol anyway, of course you can take the vaccine, right? So this is an example where the vaccine is portrayed as somewhat poisonous, but the overall sentiment is pro-vaccine, that you should get it. So we can see even positive narratives about vaccines can be potentially weaponized in the future. The third category is development, provision, and access. And two examples here are Russia has won the race to find a COVID vaccine. So this example is prevalent in the online chatter, not because it's necessarily wrong, and we're not making any judgment here about the Sputnik V vaccine. And in fact, there have been a lot of positive reports about it lately. We're not listing this narrative to make any judgment, but just to say that part of the vaccine narratives that we've seen online has been about the race to develop the vaccine. We've seen a number of articles, a lot of chatter about the race and the geopolitics in developing vaccines. Then another example in this category is provision of vaccines around the world is inequitable, which is probably true. But again, it's worth thinking about how this narrative might be weaponized in the future. So in this case, you may think someone may say, look, if you need the whole world to be vaccinated in order to make a difference, then it's never going to happen because there's just not enough vaccines. Next up, conspiracy theory. This was surprisingly popular in the French-speaking discourse about vaccines. And two examples. One is that vaccines will microchip and control entire populations. Actually, just this week, we've seen this narrative about microchip circulating online again as Australia begins its vaccine rollout. So we've just been gathering examples, and it's just one of those narratives that you would see repeatedly about vaccine. Another one is that vaccines are tools for depopulation programs. So we've seen a large proliferation of these kinds of conspiratorial claims, often relating to figures like Bill Gates and other elites, saying that they're trying to control the population and are doing so using the vaccines. The next category is liberty and freedom. So the interesting thing here is that this category was particularly popular in English-speaking communities, but not at all popular in Spanish-speaking discourse. So this means the kind of vaccine misinformation that you see in different countries across different languages can be quite different. Examples of this: it starts with a mask, moves to vaccines, and ends in total control. We've seen this a lot in the US, in the anti-lockdown, anti-quarantine, anti-mask groups, so all promoting the anti-vaccine sentiment. And the whole idea is that politicians are just finding more expansive, more aggressive ways to control us. Another example is that mandatory vaccines are harming our rights and freedom. And this is probably one of the main reasons why people across the world have been organizing and participating in anti-lockdown rallies just in the past year. Next, morality and religion. So this one was particularly popular in Spanish-speaking discourse about vaccines. And one example is that the blood of Christ is the only vaccine against COVID-19. And similarly, God has the power to enlighten scientists to discover coronavirus vaccine. So when we are trying to understand the most dominant vaccine misinformation online, in this case in English, Spanish, and French, we have two goals in mind. The first goal is to become better communicators. And what do we mean by that? As we learned last time when we talked about case studies, misinformation is not the whole picture when it comes to getting quality information about vaccines out there. Even if you eradicated misinformation, people will still have legitimate concerns and questions about vaccines. So if you want to get good quality information out there, or you want to do counter messaging against misinformation or debunking, etc., you have to understand what those questions and concerns are. The second goal here is to become better researchers. So we're going to talk a lot more about this in the next webinar, and I hope you'll join us again. So the next one is about keywords and search queries and how to do strategic searches. But then one of the main aspects of being a good researcher when it comes to online narratives is paying attention to the language and paying attention to the words that people use to talk about vaccines. Now we're moving on to data deficits. So data deficit is a fancy term to describe what happens when there is not enough supply of credible information to meet the demand. And here are some examples with the COVID-19 vaccine where we don't have enough information. First up, mRNA technology and DNA alteration are two topics that people have a lot of questions about, and there just isn't a whole lot of clear reports about them. Secondly, GMOs and aluminium. So aluminium salts are actually an ingredient that has been used in vaccines for a while, but even so, people seem to be worried about it. And this is just one of the examples of the concerns about vaccine ingredients in general. And then the third area is about legal impunity for pharmaceutical companies. And what that highlights is that people have a lot of concerns about pharmaceutical companies, and some valid ones as well. So this is how data deficits emerge and then get exploited. So usually what happens is a new or previously niche issue surfaces online, and then people have a number of legitimate questions, but then the information provided is misleading, confusing, false, or even harmful. As a result, a deficit emerges. And then malicious actors exploit the deficit by spreading false and misleading claims. Then these messages are laundered through the information ecosystem thanks to a variety of manipulation and dissemination tactics. And what happens in the end is the messages shape a certain narrative, in this case, misinformation about vaccine, and they continue to amplify the narrative so long as the gap in knowledge is still there when it's not filled. So what are our solutions here? If you're trying to fight data deficits, you have to do two things. Step one is to understand how data deficits can be exploited, and this can happen in a number of ways. First of all, misleading information can be easily duplicated and translated across multiple languages. So one thing that we've seen is networks of legitimate-looking blogs that write the same content and republish the same thing in different languages. And it's the proliferation of it and the amplification of it that make it all look really legitimate. Another thing that often happens as well is that information is slightly modified to obscure the source and reduce its traceability. It's actually not hard to do at all because, as we learned last time, misinformation often has a kernel of truth. It's easy to take something and then twist it out of context and then spread across multiple platforms. The second step is to understand how to spot a data deficit. And here are some indicators about the kind of topics that tend to have data deficits. Topics that are new or those that are not new, but then just kind of remain unknown to most of us. So no one knows much about it. Therefore, we don't have a lot of good reports on it yet. And then inaccurate, misleading information will just come in to fill the gaps. Other topics that can be at risk of having data deficit are those that are technically complex. And this is something that we've seen generally with COVID and science reports, which can be very difficult to report on in a way that's readable for a general audience. Another sign is if a topic aligns really well with pre-existing misinformation. So we just went through the 6 vaccine narratives from our research, and we may come across new vaccine-related topics that can fit easily within one of those narratives, right? For example, politicians trying to manipulate information to gain political ground, or a potential safety issue with the vaccine. So a fresh example of this we've seen with Australia's vaccine rollout this week is that there's some posts saying Prime Minister Scott Morrison was faking his vaccination, so implying that the jab was probably not safe. That's why he had to fake it, right? So it's a new example emerging online along with the rollout, but then it also fits right into the categories of vaccine misinformation about safety, as well as political and economic motives. Another thing is if a topic is politically significant in some way, it can encourage misinformation. So we also saw that in last week's session from the discussion about trust, that people are really skeptical about the influence of politics on the vaccine. So people tend to trust their personal doctors, but not so much the politicians. Another sign is that if the content is really emotionally charged, like we said before, misinformation often plays to people's emotions. And then the last sign is that if something is just an area of legitimate questioning, that can happen too. So, some topics may emerge where there's just a lot of questions to be asked about it. Maybe the quality information or reports just haven't kept up with it yet. Then we also have a data deficit, but hopefully not for too long. Then news reports and scientists would keep up and then comment on it, answer all those questions, then this problem will be solved. Okay, now here's some tips about how to figure out data deficits and how to fill those gaps. The first practical tip is to do a search on Google or YouTube on a particular topic and take note of the results. Then you can try to fill the gaps where quality information is lacking by providing quality information. So we did a little search for the term vaccine injury on YouTube, and we found all of these reports that are like individual anecdotes about vaccine injuries. Most of them are against vaccine, some of them are pro-vaccine, but what ties all of them together is that they didn't do a good job of putting the side effects of vaccines into perspective. And perspective is usually what people need when they are reading about vaccines. So it's one thing to say, this person took the vaccine and developed Bell's palsy or had an allergic reaction. But what matters is the context, right? So what did the trial say about that? How likely are you going to have a similar reaction? And if you get the vaccine, what is the risk? So these search results just didn't do that, didn't provide any context, didn't put anything in perspective. The point here of doing a search for different search terms that you expect people on social media may use can help you understand where the gaps in good information are and try to fill them. The second tip is to bolster your social media presence. Depending on whether you're a journalist, a fact checker, or a part of civic society organization, it might be worth developing your presence on social so that you can interact with people and provide them with accurate information. So one thing you could do, for example, is to do an AMA or Ask Me Anything on Reddit. And if you actually go to Reddit's website, they have a whole media partnerships toolkit where you can get tips for engaging with an audience and doing things like AMAs. And depending on which country you're tuning in from or which community you're surfing, maybe Reddit isn't popular. Maybe Facebook is where your audience is. So then you may want to try to develop a presence on Facebook with your organization and interact with people in some of the groups. But then one of the important things here is that you also need to have protocols about how you act as an organization on social media and trying to be safe. And this is actually something we'll talk about in the later session about being in Facebook groups and how to conduct yourself. Okay, then the third tip is to avoid asking open-ended questions on social media. And if you do, have a moderator ready to offer fact checks in the comments. If you do a search on YouTube for Bell's palsy, COVID vaccine, you can see a lot of these headlines are framed as questions. For instance, can the coronavirus vaccine cause Bell's palsy? Is Bell's palsy at risk with the COVID-19 vaccine? Did 3 of the 4 volunteers develop Bell's palsy after being vaccinated? So the reason we say to avoid asking open-ended questions is because often in the comment section of social media, there is a lot of misinformation. And even if you intend to provide like a factual answer in the video, after asking an open-ended question in the headline of your video, you may not be able to stop the spread of misinformation in the comment section. And here comes the last section where we discuss oversupply. So oversupply is when sheer quantity of information leads to confusion and news avoidance. So this often happens when people are overwhelmed by the amount of information about a certain topic. So like COVID-19 or vaccines. I think we all feel that way sometimes, even though we work in this field. And so these are some examples of where we may have too much information about the COVID vaccine. For example, information about the vaccine development and trials, because a lot of information about those things are very technical, like which phase, how many people involved in the trials, etc. So sometimes when there's so much information about those things, it can be really confusing for the general public. There have also been a lot of reports on the race to the vaccine, but not enough contextual reports that help people make sense of it. Last time we talked about Dengvaxia, the dengue fever vaccine in the Philippines. There was a lot of media coverage about the protracted Senate investigation into the vaccine, but most of them were focusing on corruption charges and not so much about the safety and efficacy about the vaccine. So sure, there was an oversupply of reports, but they were not really helping people make health decisions or understand what was important about the government's decision about a vaccine. Also, we can have an oversupply of reports that are just based on press releases from pharmaceutical companies. And as we know, people can feel a little bit unsure about these companies. So reports that are basically just referring to their press releases don't exactly inspire confidence.